Good afternoon, everyone. We're waiting just a moment while everyone is admitted to the webinar, and we'll get started in just a few seconds. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Providence College Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hayne, and I'm a member of the Philosophy Department and the Humanities program here at PC, and the director of the forum. The Humanities Forum is an initiative of the Humanities program and exists to provide a regular space each Friday for the entire college community to reflect on some of the deepest human things. Before we begin, let me remind you that today's event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website early next week. You can ask a question at any point during today's presentation by typing in the Q&A box available at the bottom of your screen. You should feel free to submit questions whenever they occur to you during the discussion, and as always, we'll do our best to get to as many as possible before we conclude. Before I introduce today's guest, I would first like to introduce Paul Gondreau, who is my co-host for this afternoon's discussion. Professor Gondreau is a member of the theology department here at PC, specializing in moral theology within the Thomistic tradition. He also regularly teaches a very popular course here on J.R.R. Tolkien and the Christian tradition, and I'm really delighted that he's able to be with us today.
Great to be
Our
with you.
distinguished guest today is Professor Holly Ordway, the Cardinal Francis George Fellow of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute and visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and writes regularly on imaginative apologetics, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Inklings. She's also a subject editor for the Journal of Inklings Studies and a published poet. She's the author of Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach to defending the faith. Not God's Type, an atheist academic lays down her arms. And most recently, and most importantly for today's discussion, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, published just this past January by Word on Fire Academic. The past 2 decades have seen an explosion of interest in Tolkien, including, of course, Peter Jackson's film versions of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and the recent biographical film released in 2019, directed by Dom Karkovsky. There's also been a series of significant new scholarly editions of Tolkien's work, publication of new manuscript materials, and rich and complex developments within scholarly reflection on Tolkien's work and legacy. Professor Ordway's recent book is part of this new golden age of Tolkien scholarship, and it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome her today to the Humanities Forum to discuss Tolkien's Modern Reading. Holly, thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to our conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. It is a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this conversation. I'm going to be sort of trying this afternoon to sort of connect 2 different themes in my work that you mentioned, the imaginative apologetics and Tolkien, since the title of this talk, as folks will have seen in the invitation, is Imaginative Apologetics and the Work of J.R.R. Tolkien. So I want to talk a little bit about that, drawing on this research that I've done for Tolkien's Modern Reading. And then in our questions, we can touch on both of those things as people have questions about them. So I want to start out by just sort of asking that question of what do we mean by the imagination? Because we want to talk about imaginative apologetics. Well, what do we mean by imagination? So I would say, first of all, at the most basic level, drawing on Tolkien's definition, the imagination is the ability in our minds to picture something that's not present, what Tolkien calls the mental power of image making. And so we use our imagination, for instance, when we are reading a story and we create a picture in our minds about what the author is describing. And we also use our imagination when we're daydreaming or envisioning hypothetical events or future events. And that might be the sort of most common idea of imagination, but it's also very limited because, in fact, the imagination is a fundamental aspect of human cognition. It's necessary for us to make judgments about the truth or falsity of really anything. Because in order to make a judgment about something, our reason has to have something meaningful to work on. And that's what C.S. Lewis means when he says that reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. My friend and colleague Michael Ward, commenting on this idea, explains that things must rise up out of the swamp of nonsense into the realm of meaning if the imagination is to get any handle on them. Only then can we begin to judge whether their meanings are true or false. Before anything can be either true or false, it must mean. Now, most of the time, this meaning-making function of the imagination happens so naturally and intuitively that we don't even notice it. But it's just fundamental to the work of imaginative apologetics, that is, to the presentation of the truths of the Christian faith that makes use of the imagination. Because only when something has meaning, which is generated by the imagination, do we have the opportunity, the ability to use our reason to judge whether something is true or false. And in a way, more fundamentally, only when something has meaning do we care whether it's true or whether it's false. And this is really significant today in our modern culture, and especially when we consider this huge category of the nones, the religiously indifferent, because this is an area where we find just the single most important area for evangelization. Because to the average person who, we might pass in the street, especially the average young person sitting in a college classroom, words like God, prayer, heaven, hell, resurrection, etc., are really just jargon words. And they're really empty of meaning. And this undercuts the basic motivation to find out if the Christian faith is true. Because if a word like sin or grace doesn't have any real meaning, there's really no motivation for a person to find out if there's any relevance for that concept in their own lives. So that gives us kind of an idea of the idea of imaginative apologetics and the role of imagination in presenting the faith. Well, what can we learn from Tolkien about this process? Now, in order to address this question, we first need to challenge a very common misconception about Tolkien's attitude toward modern culture. The most common and most popular image of Tolkien presents him as just totally averse to modernity, firmly stuck in the past by his own choice. This is what we see in a lot of books about him. It's what we saw, for instance, in the recent biopic about him. We have this image of him just nostalgic and backward looking. And this is despite the fact that his books are globally popular all the way into the 21st century. Somehow it's assumed by cultural commentators that he was backward looking and interested in nothing beyond the boundaries of his professional interest in medieval literature. And his biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, even went so far as to say straight out that he took no notice at all of modern literature, that he read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. Boom. But in fact, as I found in my research for my book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, I discovered that that's actually not correct. Carpenter was completely mistaken. And the picture is very, very different indeed. In fact, the idea of Tolkien as stuck in the past and purely backward looking is completely false. Now, to be sure, Tolkien was a medievalist, and he was completely steeped and immersed and engaged by the writings, the language, literature of the Middle Ages. But he was also very interested in the literature and the culture of the modern day. Far from being a nostalgic and backward-looking figure, Tolkien was consistently engaged with the modern world. For instance, he read the newspaper every day. And on one occasion, when an interviewer seemed surprised by that, he added that he subscribed to 3 newspapers and said, "I take a strong interest in what is going on, both in the university and in the country and in the world." That's Tolkien's own description of his newspaper reading. One of his friends recalled group lunches in which Tolkien was a participant, where they argued topics from the news of the day, including the morality of the Nuremberg trials, or the moral aspect of atomic bombing and total war in general. So these are the kinds of, up and coming issues of the modern world that he was interested in. He was informed about enough to talk about. In his 1959 retirement lecture, he declared, "I have the hatred of apartheid in my bones." And this is a statement that's been quoted various times, but not enough note has been taken of when he said it. In 1959, in making this statement, in making his public opposition to apartheid, Tolkien, in fact, predated the British anti-apartheid movement. He predated the international backlash against apartheid that was prompted by the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. So given this context, it's notable that he used his retirement speech, which was a significant event for the university. It was reported on by the local press. They had a full house. He used this retirement speech to repudiate a racist regime that was not yet a matter of public concern in Britain. And in the lecture, although he immediately shifts back to academic issues, Tolkien was quite savvy about academic politics, and he would have been very well aware that his audience would pick up on this comment and note it as a political statement. As another example, Tolkien was a willing and even an enthusiastic adopter of modern technology. And this may seem startling at first. Tolkien and modern technology, what? But he used that newfangled device, the typewriter, not only for mundane tasks like letter writing, but also for preparing manuscripts, both as an academic writer and as a creative writer. And this is, in contrast, something that his friend C.S. Lewis simply refused to do. Lewis used a dip pen his entire life and refused to touch typewriter. But Tolkien, in fact, owned several different typewriters, including one with fancy keyboards for philological symbols. And Tolkien is also intrigued by the potential of audio recordings and the radio, two technologies that, again, were brand new in his day. Now today, things like typewriters and tape recorders may seem old-fashioned and hardly worth describing as technology at all, but in Tolkien's lifetime, they were at the cutting edge of technology. They were at the cutting edge of progress in personal communication. So I venture to say that if Tolkien were alive today, he'd be willing to have an event like this to talk by a webinar. It's the kind of thing that he did in his day. He was an early adopter of technology that allowed him to do his teaching, his writing, his academic communication more effectively. Now, the key is that Tolkien strenuously objected to abuses of technology, but he didn't find technology itself to be evil in and of itself. So for instance, he actually admitted in an interview that he enjoyed driving and riding in cars, thought that was great. What he objected to was the destructive habits of road builders who blasted through the countryside to put roads everywhere. So much more nuanced than we have typically taken him to be. His social circle is often claimed to be very narrow, focusing on the male-only Inklings group. But in fact, Tolkien was married for over 50 years. He had many women friends among the English faculty, and he had many female students and academic collaborators in his decades as a teacher, both at Leeds and at Oxford. Moreover, he read many women writers throughout his life and took their work seriously. And some of the authors he especially praised included Mary Renault, Agatha Christie, Beatrix Potter, and Edith Nesbit. And in fact, his interests were so wide-ranging that one friend remarked that in conversation, he would go 60 miles an hour with a subject from apples to elephants. He didn't mention the Beatles, but just about everything else came into Tolkien's conversation. Now, his reading of modern literature is similarly expansive. He enjoyed, as we might expect, a great deal of children's literature, including Lewis Carroll, but he also knew well the work of Mark Twain. He delighted in Agatha Christie's mysteries, but he also took seriously the ultra-modernist work of James Joyce. He particularly enjoyed the poetry of Roy Campbell and Dylan Thomas. He read a great deal of science fiction, naming Isaac Asimov as a favorite author. The list of his reading is extensive and varied, By my count, there are nearly 150 modern authors and more than 200 specific titles that we can be certain that Tolkien knew of modern literature, that is, after 1850. He was not allergic to modern culture, far from it. Tolkien knew the literature of the past supremely well, but he also knew the literature of his present day, reading discerningly and responding to it thoughtfully and creatively. Now, it's particularly worth noting that Tolkien, a devout Christian, read many authors who had views that were very different from his own, and he engaged with their work seriously, appreciating literary merit where he found it without compromising his own deeply held beliefs. So, for instance, he enjoyed H. Rider Haggard's adventure tales, such as She and King Solomon's Mines, despite the author's occasional ventures into pantheism and spiritualism. He admired the science fiction of the dedicated atheist H.G. Wells. Now, we tend to think of Wells today as purely a science fictional author, the creator of stories such as War of the Worlds. But in fact, he was a Richard Dawkins of his day. His book, The Outline of History, presented a materialist, secular view of history that flatly rejected the divinity of Christ, rejected the continuity of the church's teachings. Yet, despite his sharply differing views on matters theological, Tolkien held Wells' science fiction in high regard, calling him one of the forgotten old masters of science fiction. Another significant figure in this regard is E.R. Edison, who is known today, if at all, for his book, The Worm Auroboros, which is a tale of heroic adventure on the planet Mercury. Tolkien proclaimed himself familiar with all that E.R. Edison wrote and praised him as the greatest and most convincing writer of invented worlds that I have read. Now, this high praise is particularly interesting in view of Tolkien's equally strong opposition to what he called Edison's peculiarly bad views. He believed that Edison was coming to admire arrogance and cruelty under the influence of an evil and indeed silly philosophy. Now, Edison's philosophy, as he expresses it in his science fiction novels, is consciously pagan or pantheistic, and Edison conceived of the universe as engaged in a constant, eternal conflict between good and evil. And Edison's literary heaven had, according to him, it had to contain an element of evil because it is a heaven of action. So thus, Edison conflates goodness with stagnation and boredom. Now, both the pantheism and the dualism of this view, which holds to the necessity of evil, is contrary to Tolkien's Christian faith, which maintains that God and creation are distinct and that God's perfect goodness has no ontologically equivalent opposite. Yet, despite their serious philosophical differences, Tolkien called Edison a great writer and said that he read Edison's works with great enjoyment for their sheer literary merit. Now, amongst his fellow Christians, Tolkien was equally fair-minded. He greatly admired the work of his fellow Catholic G.K. Chesterton, for instance, saying that he felt the arguments of the Apologetics book, The Everlasting Man, to be absolutely valid. But he sharply criticized another Catholic, Hilaire Belloc. He was a strong early supporter of the writers of C.S. Lewis, for instance, helping to get Lewis's book Out of the Silent Planet published. But he had more qualified feelings about Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. But I want to say here that the very common claim that Tolkien hated or abhorred the Narnia Chronicles is hugely overblown. This is one of the things I trace out in my research, and it turns out that he didn't care for them personally, but in later years, he even described the Chronicles as deservedly very popular, and he kept copies of them on hand for his grandchildren to read. So ideas that he despised the Chronicles are really a later invention. They're not representative of Tolkien's actual more nuanced views on Narnia. Now, there's many more examples that I could give, but even from this very small sampling, we can see that Tolkien engaged willingly, eagerly, extensively with a very wide range of viewpoints in his reading of modern literature. Now, this already tells us something important about Tolkien's Christian imagination. It's capacious, it's generous in spirit, it's thoughtful and discerning. So let's consider now how it was that Tolkien made use of what he read. And we'll take as our point of investigation the hobbits, these small, humble, but tough people who play such an important role in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Well, where did the hobbits come from? Now we can trace three distinct strands. And here I want to point out that one of the things that I argue in Tolkien's modern reading, and I think is really important, is that creativity is multifaceted. Tolkien, when he drew on what he read, did not just adopt something from a book, not in the sort of cut and paste idea of sources, taking something and using it directly. Tolkien engaged deeply with what he read, he transformed it, and creativity draws on many different sources. So when we talk about influences and sources, we should be thinking of it in terms of many different factors coming into play. So with the case of the hobbits, there are three distinct factors that we can identify as playing a role in the hobbits, and undoubtedly there are many more. And I think this will help us, if we think about his creativity in general, to realize he's drawing from multiple sources of influence at all times, in a very rich and capacious view of his creative imagination. Right, so back to the hobbits. Now, one strand in the creation of the hobbits is a book called The Marvelous Land of Snurgs by the author E.A. Wick-Smith. Now, Tolkien explicitly names this book as, in his words, an unconscious source book for the hobbits. The Snurgs are child-sized and long-lived. They're a gregarious people, loving company, and they have a great deal in common with hobbits, as Tolkien would come to depict them a few years later, both in habits and in appearance. A second strand is Beatrix Potter's rabbits. Tolkien knew Potter's work well, and he held it in high esteem. C.S. Lewis once remarked that he and Tolkien have often played with the idea of a pilgrimage to see her at her home in the Lake District, and pictured what fun it would be to shoulder aside the mobs of people who want to show you all the Wordsworth places with a brief rejoinder, "We are looking for Miss Potter." Now, Beatrix Potter is best known for her rabbits, and who well may have contributed to the overall concept of hobbits. For the hobbits have a distinctly rabbity quality, especially in The Hobbit. We have multiple comparisons of Bilbo to a rabbit. And Tolkien himself once admitted that in the creation of the name Hobbit, he said, "Its faint suggestion of rabbit appealed to me." Like hobbits, Potter's rabbits are human-like, but not human. They're quick and quiet of foot. They're easily overlooked by large persons. They're garden-loving and hole-dwelling. And Mrs. Rabbit, the mother of Peter Rabbit, makes a living by selling various goods from the front of her little neat sandy rabbit hole. I almost said hobbit hole. Her rabbit hole, various goods including rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. And perhaps such an image helped contribute to the idea of hobbits living in comfortable holes underground with plenty of food and a well-stocked tobacco jar, which is the very final word of The Hobbit. Now, a third and completely different strand is the novel Babbitt. This novel, published in 1922 by the American realist author Sinclair Lewis, is a satire upon American middle-class culture and social conformism. Tolkien said that he had read all of Sinclair Lewis's books, and he explained to an interviewer that the word hobbit might have been associated with Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. And Tolkien goes on to say, Babbitt has the same bourgeois smugness that hobbits do. His world is the same limited place. Now, this is a sizable admission. Here, Tolkien has conceded three things: a linguistic debt, a parallel with his protagonist's personality, and a parallel with the constrained home life of Hobbiton. So Snurgs, rabbits, and babbits. Tolkien took in these different sources over a span of years in very different contexts, and he assimilated certain elements, he rejected others, and he added others. For instance, material that came from his own experiences and personality. And all of this was grist for his imaginative mill. Or to use his own image, it was leaf mold on the forest floor, formed by many different fallen leaves, which nourished his own tree of tales. And Tolkien himself conceded, as he said, that no one of us can really invent or create in a void. He recognized that he did not write in isolation and knew that he could not have done so even if he had wanted to. So what does this show us about the workings of his imagination? Now, we should note that none of these three sources of the Hobbits that we've mentioned are explicitly Christian. They're part of the wider world of literary culture in which he operated. They're stories that he enjoyed with his children and books that he read for his own pleasure. And from these diverse materials, taken freely and with appreciation from authors who may or may not have agreed with any of his religious views, he drew some of the ingredients for the characters who provide some of the most deeply Christian images in Middle-earth. In The Hobbit, Bilbo is the burglar of the party, which is hardly a Christian image at first glance, except that his role turns out to be far more than just recovering the dwarves' gold from the dragon Smaug's hoard, and thus fulfilling their goals of greed and vengeance. Rather, in the end, Bilbo absconds with the Arkenstone, the one gem beyond price in the hoard, which he knows full well the dwarf Thorin would never part with, because Thorin's afflicted by dragon sickness that fills his heart with greed and violence. And Bilbo then just hands it over to Bard the Bowman in order that it can be used in negotiations and thus avoid tragic violence between the people of Lake Town on the one side and the elves, and Thorin and the dwarves on the other. So Bilbo allows the Arkenstone to be counted as his own full 1/14 share of the dragon's treasure. And so in just handing it over to Bard and the people of Lake Town and the elves, he willingly sacrifices his own wealth and his status with the dwarves for the good of others. His freedom from avarice allows him to become a Christ figure. And in the end, we see that this Christ-like action brings about reconciliation and restoration. Now, Tolkien does not make this into an allegory by any means, but he skillfully draws our attention, if we have ears to hear, to the Christian connections. The key chapter for this aspect of the story is called A Thief in the Night, alluding to our Lord's description of himself in Matthew chapter 24. And later, when the dying Thorin is reconciled to Bilbo, he calls him good thief. So turning to the Lord of the Rings, we find again that the hobbits are of central importance, both in terms of the story and its spiritual significance. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin are childlike figures. They're weak and simple in comparison to mighty figures like Aragorn or Gandalf. Yet the fate of all the free people of Middle-earth rests in the end on these small shoulders. Frodo and Sam are particularly strong Christ figures in their trek across Mordor to cast the One Ring into the crack of doom. But all of the hobbits embody a deeply Christian image. In their childlike stature, we see a profound humility, and we're reminded that Jesus said, "Let the children come unto me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." Tolkien said of The Lord of the Rings that it is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion. So this is one of the most remarkable statements that Tolkien said about his own writing, in which he says straight out that The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally religious and Catholic, and then confuses all later scholars by turning around and saying, that's why I cut out all of the religious bits. What? And so the key point here, and I see this more after looking at what he read and what he liked and what he didn't of his other Christian authors. The key is that he is working at a more subtle level. When we see these Christian aspects of the hobbits, for instance, they're all presented in a way that's beneath the surface of the story, never obvious, never intrusive. Tolkien's really much too savvy and skilled as a storyteller to make things really obvious like that. And then obviously there's many more Christian connections in The Lord of the Rings. What Tolkien's doing is offering rich theological connections below the surface, so deeply embedded that they don't obtrude. The tale, he says, is consciously built on or out of certain religious ideas, but does not mention them overtly, still less preach them. Built on, but not preached about. Readers with a knowledge of these things can notice them and catch the echoes, or not, as they prefer. As he put it, the story is mainly concerned with the fall, mortality, and the machine. And the theological foundation of these themes, even when presented implicitly, makes them richly suited for what he called applicability, as opposed to allegory. Applicability, which rests in the freedom of the reader to make connections. So we can see that Tolkien's able to draw from a remarkably diverse set of sources. In our example, Snurgs, Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Money, Babbitt, none of which were particularly Christian, to aid in the creation of stories and characters who are profoundly rooted in the Christian faith. And furthermore, Tolkien's wide-ranging tastes in modern reading reveal something characteristic about his sub-created world. Nothing was too small or too grand, too weird or too ordinary, too silly or too dark to be left out. And so he shows us the value of reading widely, finding what's good and true and beautiful, not just in works written by fellow believers, but by authors whose philosophical and religious views are contrary to our own. Tolkien did not, by any means, feel obliged to agree with everyone whose books he read. Far from it. He didn't even feel obliged to agree with the people in his own tribe. But this did not stop him from reading their work and taking it seriously. And he also shows us the value and the importance of reading charitably and with a generous spirit. Tolkien could certainly be curmudgeonly if he took against an author or a book, but his reading as a whole shows his willingness to allow himself to be challenged, to enter into different points of view. And he shows us that this wide-ranging charitable exploration of modern culture can and should result in a creative, transformative engagement with it. Tolkien did not ignore the problems of the modern world, such as war, doubt, suffering, ecological destruction, totalitarianism. Rather, he made a profound response to it in the form of the Silmarillion, the Hobbits, and above all, the Lord of the Rings. And I would add that perhaps most importantly, Tolkien shows us by example the value of an honestly lived faith. He experienced great suffering in his life, the loss of his father as a young child and his mother as a boy, serving in the trenches of World War I, a conflict in which most of his close friends were killed, putting up with chronic illness, living through World War II, in which two of his own sons served in uniform. He didn't have an easy life. Yet through it all, he kept a strong and sustaining faith in Christ. And it's this confidence and trust, I would suggest, that helped him to make The Lord of the Rings deeply Christian, even while deliberately making that religious element hidden, subtle, and operating below the surface of the story. And that brings us back to our connection with imaginative apologetics that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. If we are to transform modern culture for Christ, we'll do well to take a lesson from this Oxford professor, the inventor of hobbits, to root ourselves so deeply in Christ that we can boldly and with confidence explore the wide world of our modern Middle Earth and find ways to proclaim its King. Thank you. Now I hope we will have lots of questions and talk about things.
Holly, thank you so much. What a rich kind of overview of this book, which I'm really grateful for and I've learned a lot from. Just a quick reminder to those in the audience, please feel free to type questions whenever you're ready, and we will integrate them into our conversation over the next 25 minutes or so. I'd like to give the first question to my colleague, Paul.
Thank you very much, Holly. That was wonderful. Hobbits. you mention often in your book, you talk of small c, Catholic meaning, of course, universal. And I'm just wondering, you've noted, you've touched upon Tolkien's Christian Catholic faith. How much was his Catholic faith, Catholic with a big C, how much did that play a role in his imagination? I'm thinking here of an Augustinian strain, perhaps. In the Confessions, Augustine talks about taking the spoils of Egypt when he's referencing the role that Neoplatonic philosophy played in his own conversion, and he likens it to the Hebrews taking gold and silver objects with them from Egypt when they were liberated, because anything that's beautiful and good belongs to God and thus belongs to his people. So how much, therefore, it was his expansive imagination, his own, as you call it, his imaginative leaf mold? How much was that leaf mold? How much did it feed upon, or did it flow from his Catholic faith?
Well, I think his overall view, his willingness to engage with it, certainly, I think, comes from his Catholic faith. I think that it gave him the confidence to step out and to do that, to realize that, anything that's good, true, and beautiful reflects God's goodness, truth, and beauty. So, go ahead and engage with it. There's a kind of fearlessness in that I do think is deeply rooted in his Catholic faith. And I think, one of the things that's sort of tying into my research for my next book, which is going to be on his Christian faith, I think that a significant influence for him is actually the Oratorian spirituality, the Oratorian fathers who played such a big role in his youth and indeed his whole life, because the Oratorians are specifically engagers with culture. Their mission, their charism is to use the arts in evangelization and the faith, especially music. But I tend to think that vision, that idea of using the arts to engage with people to help draw them into the faith, received at an early age, I tend to think that helped to sort of set the foundation for Tolkien's willingness to engage with these things in his own reading and in his writing.
I'm hoping Paul's internet connection is a
Thank
little
you.
unstable, I think, but hopefully he'll be back with us. Holly, I'd like to ask a question that brings a couple things together that's in your book from a couple different places. And this is a question about the importance of Tolkien's modern reading overall, for him, for his imagination, for his writing, for his life in certain respects. And you say, let me read I'm going to read around a couple passages here. This is at the very beginning, the first chapter. And you say this: given his professional work, as well as his personal interests, his modern reading is undoubtedly a relatively minor element in the total picture, given his interest in the Middle Ages, his professional work, and so on. And it's a comment you repeat on the last page. Right before the very last paragraph, you say, we readily concede that it's a relatively minor role, all things considered, but it matters. Now, I want to push on this a little bit, and let me talk about, so the very last paragraph, which gives, and for those of you in the audience, let me tell a little bit about this story. It's a beautiful ending, I think, that you give us. Tolkien is downstairs working away on a picture of Rivendell. It's late at night. He was notoriously something of a night owl. His son, Christopher, who's young, I don't remember just how old he is, but he's a pretty young boy. He comes downstairs. He's worried. Why is his father awake? Is he okay? He comes downstairs. His father comforts him. And Christopher lets drop one tear. And the tear lands on the painting. And Tolkien works it into the paint, instead of being upset at his son, he works it into the drawing. Really quite a moving image. Now, I take it you end with that story, partly because, now correct me if I'm wrong, but you could think of that tear as a form of modernity, something that is integrated, that is worked in, that becomes integral, and that is something deeply human, something of flesh and blood, our own flesh and blood, as you describe in the paragraph. And let me just here, I know this is a long setup, but let me read one last little passage from Tolkien that you give us. This is the bottom of this is page 20, but you're talking about Tolkien as an interpreter of tradition. And Tolkien says, he really has this remarkable passage where he says, "That's what I always wanted to do. Mythological things like Greek or Norse myths, I tried to improve on them and modernize them. To modernize them is to make them credible, believable." And so I just want to maybe to say something, I know this is a lot, but say something about this sort of, your very reserved claim for how important the modern reading is. And yet that ending image, the passage from Tolkien that at least raises the question of how perhaps important modernity really was for Tolkien.
Yes, well, you managed to hit on some of the really key points. And I tell you, that quote about modernizing things to make them credible, I was shocked when I saw it. I thought, this is Tolkien? Yes, those are his own words talking about what he was trying to do. And this is the kind of thing that has gotten overlooked because everybody assumes, broadly speaking, that of course he was medievally minded. He wouldn't say something like that, but he did. So the reason I'm so cautious about saying this is just a small piece of the puzzle is that his professional work is so massively medieval that just if you step back and you look at the whole larger edifice, you can't help but see, okay, well, he was one of the most learned men in the world in his professional area. So just proportionately, one has to take account of that. And I also wanted to guard against the idea that I was setting up an opposition, that I wanted to say this is somehow more important, because I absolutely am not setting up an opposition. And I wanted to make sure that nobody thought I was. What I'm trying to do is to add a dimension to the portrait. And it may well be that it might move the portrait from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. But in doing that, it takes away nothing from the existing portrait that's already there. It just adds the additional dimension. And I think helps make what's already been done more, more relevant. You can understand better his medieval work, I think, if you also understand his engagement with modernity. It's so I'm very deliberately trying to contextualize this as a both and not an either or, that what we understand of his modern reading and his engagement with modernity is massively more than we thought before. Because before, with a few minor exceptions, people have thought that he had no real engagement with modernity. Yes, there have been some scholars who've realized this wasn't the case, but even they didn't put the whole picture together. But again and again and again, when you look at biographies, when you look at even academics writing about Tolkien, they've just taken Humphrey Carpenter's line completely, not unreasonably. He was the authorized biographer. You trust him unless you have reason not to, which now we do, and assume that he didn't care about anything modern. So then in bringing in this modern aspect, it radically revises the view, I think, but it does so by adding this whole layer of new depth and texture, I would say.
Yeah. You might be more modest than you deserve, Holly. You say at one point that it moves Tolkien perhaps into the timeless, from a kind of time-bound antiquarianism into something timeless. And I suppose in one sense, that's just adding to something that's already there to give it a third dimension. But it feels to me, what you present feels to me as, in certain respects, a revelation. It helps you reread everything that he's written in certain respects, I think.
Well, thank you. I mean, certainly I felt as I was doing this research, this was a 10-year project. It took so long because I kept discovering all these new things. And the book I thought I was going to write turned out to be not the book I ended up writing because there was so much more. And just seeing how this picture complexified and became richer, I just found that I myself came to admire and I think understand Tolkien a lot better by the end of it than I did when I started.
I have a question from Dave O'Connor, who is a philosopher at the University of Notre Dame. And this year he's our visiting Randall Chair here at Providence College. And he says, your book focuses on Tolkien's reading of poetry, drama, and fiction. No doubt you also came across much evidence, or perhaps lack of evidence, about his reading in literary criticism or aesthetics. Did you come across evidence of his reading Walter Pater, especially Pater's essay on William Morris's poetry and medievalism?
I'm afraid I didn't. And this is partly since I did focus really quite tightly on fiction, on literature. Given what turned out to be the scope of the project, I kind of had to resolutely close my eyes to things that were nonfiction. Nope, not going there. So I don't know. I don't know that what there is to be said about this. I know that I didn't come across anything specifically about that line of literary criticism. Doesn't mean he didn't read it, but I didn't come across anything along those lines.
Paul, I'm glad you're back with us. We
Yeah.
lost you for a second. I'd love to give you a chance to follow up. I'm not sure if you heard all of Holly's answer or would like to ask a second follow-up question.
Yeah, my apologies. I had to restart my computer because of the connection issues. So I did miss her answer to your question, Raymond. It was a wonderful question, but I did catch her answer to my question. I have another more very general question, which will seem a little snarky, but it's not intended to be that. It's really meant to allow you, Holly, to just give you the opportunity to underscore the kind of cash value, the bottom line of your research. And that is, why does it matter? Why does it matter that Tolkien has such an interest in modern literature, contrary to the image that his biographer has presented to us and from others? Why should we care about this?
See, I love this question actually, because I think it's an important question. And this is something that I wrestled with really quite from the start of the project, because Tolkien himself has some fairly stiff words about reductive source study. And as you know, we don't have to take into account an author's views when we write about the author, but I respect Tolkien. And so I wanted to, what does he say about source study? I don't want to do reductive source study. I don't want to be cutting open the ball to find the bounce. I want to make sure that I'm engaging with this kind of well. And for me, that question has always been, why should we care? And I think this kind of gets back, and it touches on something that Raymond said, just a moment ago, this timelessness, because really the question that got me started in this project back 10 years ago was, how do we account for the Lord of the Rings? Because here we have a book that people often think of as being purely medieval. You have a pre-modern world, you've got wizards and, dwarves and elves, you've got all the trappings, you got quest, you got all the trappings of a standard medieval tale. And partly we associate this with medievalism because of all the copies of Tolkien that came after him that then just picked up on the surface elements, which is another thing. So how is it that this story is so powerful that it gets translated into dozens of languages, Turkish and Albanian and, and Czech and, Japanese worldwide? It's hugely popular and the popularity is only increasing. How is it that books like The Silmarillion, which is not an easy read, hugely popular, how do we account for this? And I just found no satisfactory answer for that question. And I think it has to do with what I eventually, said is his sort of timeless quality. Bill Fliss, the archivist at Marquette, in his work with Tolkien fandom, said that he has found that reading of Tolkien is what he calls transgenerational. It's picked up anew in every generation. This is kind of remarkable. So how do we account for that? And I think that that's a question worth asking when you have an author who is obviously speaking so powerfully to the modern day, speaking so powerfully to people's needs and, interests and to the issues of the modern world. How do we account for that? And so I think understanding the role that his modern reading played in that and the way that it relates to his medieval reading, I think it's important because it helps us start to understand the creative process that gives us this timeless, transgenerational, globally, and diachronically powerful book. It helps us to understand what's going on with that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I have a question from Father Michael Weibley, who's a Dominican here at Providence College, and he's going to take us to the movies. He says, thank you for your presentation. To ask something particular, what do you believe the Lord of the Rings films miss or add in the imagination of Tolkien as you present it? What might be a significant example from the film and the books?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'll start by saying that I think that the Lord of the Rings films, I like them. I think on the whole they're well done. We will not speak of the Hobbit films. We will pretend they don't exist. But the Lord of the Rings films, I think, especially the extended editions, I think are well done. I think they, for the most part, they do bring to life a lot of Tolkien's vision. They miss certain key things. One of them is the Catholic element, which I think gets more sort of pushed aside. We don't see that as coming through as much as it does in the book. And I also think that Jackson's view of the hero is off. For instance, Faramir gets a short shrift in the films. In the book, he is able to not be tempted by the ring. He says, if I saw it on the road, I would pass it by. And that's correct. He lets Frodo and Sam go onward in their quest. We see a morally sound, healthy, morally sound person who's able to do the right thing and not be tempted, be tempted, but not give in to the temptation of trying to grasp after power. And in that, he becomes a powerful contrast to Boromir, who does fall, who, convinces himself that it's for a good end, but then grasps after power and, in a very destructive way. And that's messed up in the films. Jackson, I think, just isn't able to take the step of recognizing the kind of wholeness and moral health that allows a character like Faramir to exist. And I think that he dwells a little bit too much on sort of the angst of say Aragorn. And this is an interesting question, I think, because there's a lot of self-doubt in Jackson's Aragorn, much more than there ought to be. He becomes too much of an angsty modern hero. But Tolkien's Aragorn is not the cardboard hero figure that people often think he is, that Jackson thinks. I think Jackson thinks he's correcting from that, because Aragorn is in fact very psychologically modern. I think he draws a lot, as I argue in Tolkien's modern reading, from heroes like Richard Hannay in John Buchan's novels. He's not sure that he's doing the right thing. Now he's very clear he is the king of Gondor. He has his identity. He's very clear on that. What he's not so clear on is his in day-to-day decisions. Should I go after Frodo? Should I go after Pippin and Merry? And things go wrong, and he's not sure whether he's made the right decision. And that's very psychologically realistic. It's a very novelistic presentation of the hero, and I think Tolkien doesn't get enough credit for that. So Aragorn in the films is kind of half and half. He's in some ways, Jackson gets some of the psychological realism that Tolkien generally puts in, but he also has the existential doubt, which Tolkien doesn't have in his character.
Yeah, I totally agree with that assessment of the movies. Let's not even talk about The Hobbit, for all the good that one can say about the Lord of the Rings movies, what he does with Faramir is totally right. Speaking of Faramir, I'd like to ask you a question and see what you have to say about this. In his letters to his son, Christopher, when he's writing The Two Towers, he says to Christopher, guess who showed up out of Ithilien? Boromir's brother, Faramir. I wasn't expecting him, and I kind of like him. So he says this, and then elsewhere in his letters, and you note this in your book, that Tolkien speaks of his less creating and more reporting when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, that he became consciously aware that he was recording a story that he's not inventing himself. What did he mean by that? Would you care to address that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing because the way that Tolkien talks about his own creative process is quite interesting. And this gets into certain questions that I do also address in the book about Tolkien's mode of expression, that he tends to be very hyperbolic on the one hand, very unstated on the other hand. He's not straightforward. You've got to see context to understand what he means about things, because yeah, he overstates for effect very, very readily. And I think that is partly what's going on when we talk about, when we see him talking about, I didn't create, I just discovered, that kind of thing. I think he's talking about a way of perceiving his own creative process and slightly overstating it for effect. Now, later in his life, he's answering so many fan letters from people who basically take Middle Earth as a real place, effectively. Later in his life, he becomes more likely to talk about Middle Earth as something he has discovered rather than invented. I think that is partly out of just the habit of treating his secondary world as a created thing. But when we get to the time period that you're thinking about, Tolkien's got a curious mix of the way that he speaks of his own creative process. And I want to draw an example that is actually in Tolkien's Modern Reading about the way that he talks about the Ents, the tree folk, because he writes of them that they just kind of waltzed in, the tree beard appears, and where did these people come from? And on the surface of it, it sounds as if they were a prime example of discovery rather than invention. They just kind of walk in and he doesn't know where they came from. But in some of his notes for The Lord of the Rings, that's included in the History of Middle Earth, he has a page of notes about Treebeard, and he writes the question about whether the tree folk are Hnau, H-N-A-U. And when I saw this, my ears perked up, because that word it's an invented word, and it comes from C.S. Lewis's book Out of the Silent Planet. And the word Hnau is Lewis's invented word in the Martian language for a rational, moral being. And Tolkien, and the dating is perfect, because Tolkien has read the manuscript of Out of the Silent Planet. He's recommended it to his publisher. He loved it. He was very enthusiastic about it. And here we have Tolkien using the word Hnau, Lewis's word for this, a moral, sentient being, doesn't have to be human. He's using the word Hnau to think through what kind of being is an Ent. Is it a morally responsible being, or is it not? And this helps to account for the fact that at first he's not sure whether Treebeard is a good guy or a villain. And I think it helps understand his distinction between the Ents and the Huorns, because the Huorns are not Hnau. They're sentient, but they're a little scary. They might do something bad to you if they're not shepherded by the Ents, who definitely are Hnau. So I think this is a kind of a glimpse into the fact that he's taking in concepts and ideas and images. He's also taking the word Ent from Anglo-Saxon. He acknowledges that someplace else. So he's taking in all of these things, and his creative imagination was so sort of powerful that it just transforms them, it transmutes them, almost like a furnace, in a way, almost immediately, into something that becomes its own thing. And every now and then we get a little glimpse, like this page of notes about him reflecting, what exactly are the Ents now, or what? That gives us a glimpse of the process right before everything becomes completely assimilated in his imagination and becomes the new thing. And I think that when he speaks of his characters, for instance, as if they just walked in, I think he's speaking of them kind of in that moment after there's been that sort of transmuting moment when they have come to life, which I suspect for him was a very powerful moment, when they shifted from the amalgam sources to becoming Faramir, becoming Treebeard, becoming whomever.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I want to ask something that picks up on the movies again. So the films, especially the first trilogy for the Lord of the Rings, appropriates the imagery of the pre-Raphaelites in order to design Middle-earth. And so my question is sort of about that. Does that get Tolkien right? And the way I want to also, contribute to this question is there's a line of 19th century aesthetic reflection, especially Catholic aesthetic reflection, that goes through the pre-Raphaelites. It includes Newman, who's absent from your book, and you say we have no hard evidence of now of fiction he read. I'd be curious if you have evidence that he read nonfiction of Newman.
Unfortunately, no, which is a huge gaping absence. I mean, he must have. I mean, he was a member of the Newman Association for years. He was a vice president. He had to have done, but there is as yet no evidence of what he read yet.
And the ward of Newman's secretary at the Oratory too, for that matter. Yeah. So I'm interested, does your reading, reading Tolkien's modern reading from 1850 on, do you see it as placing him in a particular Catholic aesthetic tradition that we may not have evidence of connections to Newman or maybe the pre-Raphaelites? We get William Morris. How do you think, and this is partly about interpretation, does this help us interpret the kind of aspirations that Tolkien has artistically?
Yes, I think this is a good question, an interesting one. I certainly do think that he is influenced, I would say, by the pre-Raphaelites. I mean, he knew Morris very well, and I mean, really knew Morris. He owned almost a dozen of his books, including Morris's lecture on pattern designing that was in Tolkien's library. So we know that he was familiar with and interested in not just Morris's fiction, but in Morris's aesthetics. And Birmingham was a hub of the arts and crafts movement. At Exeter College, there's designs by Morris in the chapel. So we know that he was connected with and interested in this. We also know that in his youthful club, the Tea Club Barovian Society, the TCBS of his friends at the Canterbury School, was really intentionally, in some ways, modeled after Morris's ideas about the sort of pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. So Tolkien was very keen on that sort of idea of that Morrisian idea. So we know there's a connection there. And I think because he owned this book by Morris and pattern designing, I think we can see a connection. And Tolkien's own art, you look at his designs in particular, his designs, really you can, I think, see a connection to a lot of the sort of the Morrisian arts and crafts motifs. So I think there is definitely a connection, aesthetically speaking. But the interesting thing is that there are other lines in there. So because if you look at other aspects of Tolkien's art, he does a lot of his art is very Art Nouveau-ish. You wouldn't even think it was the same artist who did these kind of very Morrisian patterns. And one very interesting thing I found when I was looking at who Tolkien was interested in having as an illustrator for The Lord of the Rings, it turns out that he was actually very much in favor of an artist called Cor Bloch, liked Bloch's designs, liked his images of The Lord of the Rings, and in fact bought several paintings of Bloch's and hung them in his house. So obviously approved of them. Well, I tracked down some pictures of Cor Bloch's art, and let me tell you, I was quite surprised because they're modernist. They're blocky, they're square, they're shades of brown and gray. And if I didn't know for a fact that Tolkien liked Bloch's art, that he suggested Bloch as a possible illustrator for The Lord of the Rings, and that he himself bought some of these paintings and hung them in his house, I would have put Cor Bloch's art in the category of, oh, certainly Tolkien would have hated it because it's totally not what you would expect. It's at the other end of the spectrum from something like, Burne-Jones or whatnot. They're completely different. And yet we know that Tolkien liked and appreciated both of them. And so I think that kind of thing is a reminder that his aesthetic preferences were much more capacious than we tend to think. And even after you get to know him, he's still full of surprises, which is perhaps the one big takeaway that I had from my research, that one of his who wrote about him, Clive Kilby, who visited with him for a summer and attempted to help him with Silmarillion, said he was like an iceberg. that there was the brilliant part you could see above the surface, but he was aware that there was so much below the surface as well.
Mhm.
Yes, that's Tolkien.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I thank you in the audience for joining us. Paul, thank you for helping me host this afternoon. Holly, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.